Good morning. Thanks for being here this morning. A couple of years ago, I made an announcement that I was going to put the state of Ohio's checkbook on the internet. When I made that announcement, Ohio's ranking for governmental transparency was 46th in the country. As a result of OhioCheckbook.com, we earned Ohio the #1 ranking in America for governmental transparency. A lot of people think the whole point of that initiative was transparency, and while that was part of it, the real point was transferring the power from the politicians to the people, empowering everyday taxpayers to hold politicians accountable. If we're going to empower taxpayers, if we're going to give the people the power to hold the politicians accountable, we need to make sure that politicians cannot spend their entire adult life in Washington, D.C. So today I'm excited to make an announcement that I am signing a pledge to institute term limits in Washington, and even if these politicians in Washington refuse to do it, I'm going to lead by example. I'm going to volunteer to implement term limits to make sure they apply to myself. About 25 years ago, Sherrod Brown campaigned on term limits. So it was 1992, 25 years ago, Sherrod Brown campaigned on term limits. He told the voters that he pledged to only stay in Washington for 12 years. And then miraculously, after he got to Washington, he's changed his mind, and he's been in Washington for 25 years. I think voters are sick of politicians like Sherrod Brown and others who say one thing to the voters and then do something else. I also think they're sick of politicians like Sherrod Brown, who went to Washington to do good and then stayed in Washington to do well. Do well for himself, do well for his cronies, do well for his lobbyist buddies. He got addicted to the trappings of the office, he got addicted to the black tie dinners and the cocktail parties, and he forgot where he came from and forgot who he represented. Sherrod Brown's voting record is 97% with Elizabeth Warren. Think about that for a second. Elizabeth Warren represents Massachusetts. We represent Ohio. We don't want Massachusetts values or San Francisco values represented here in Ohio. What we want is Midwest, modest values represented here in Ohio. And unfortunately, somewhere in his 25 years in Washington, Sherrod Brown lost his way. But it started when he broke his pledge. It started when he broke the pledge to the voters. In this election, I'll be 40 years old, and Sherrod Brown will be 40 years in politics. Sherrod Brown has been running for political office since Richard Nixon was president. The people of Ohio want fresh blood, the people of Ohio want fresh ideas, and the only way we're going to get it is with new leaders in Washington. The only way we're going to get it is with term limits in Washington. We need to transfer the power from the politicians to the people and make sure these politicians like Sherrod Brown and others cannot spend their entire adult life in Washington, D.C. Today I'd like to welcome Nick Tomolitis here to Columbus, Ohio. Nick is with an organization called U.S. Term Limits. U.S. Term Limits is a nonpartisan organization. They work with both Democrats and Republicans who want to commit to term limits. And they ask Democratic and Republican candidates for office to take a pledge and to sign a pledge. And today I'm going to sign that pledge. Before I do that, though, I want to welcome Nick up to the podium, and then we'll sign the pledge and be glad to open up for questions. Nick.
Thank you for having me here. It's great to be in Columbus again. You know, congressional term limits is not a Republican issue. It's not a Democratic issue. It's not even really a political issue. Congressional term limits is fundamentally an American issue. I mean, this is a question about who's in charge. Is it a ruling class of Washington elites, or is it still we the people? No matter your politics, it's obvious to all of us that Washington is broken. Congress too often puts its own self-interest ahead of those it's elected to serve. And as a result, we see tremendous dysfunction. Members of Congress refuse to work together. Special interests are more powerful than they've ever been before. And frankly, most of our nation's biggest problems remain unsolved. So the career politician model of government has failed. And we need change. That is what term limits can deliver. A constitutional amendment for congressional term limits would ensure that fresh faces and ideas are getting to Washington on a regular basis. It would end the failed system of career politicians and force members of Congress to go home and actually live under the laws that they've made. And passing a congressional term limits amendment is the most popular and bipartisan issue in the United States. The only reason it's not the law of the land already is that career politicians in DC, like Sherrod Brown, are obstructing the will of their own voters. That's why we're honored that Josh is here to sign the U.S. Term Limits Pledge. And you know, what's happening here today, if you really think about it, it ought to be an unremarkable thing. A candidate for office like Josh or a member of Congress says, you know what, 80% of my voters want term limits on Congress, so I'm going to listen to them, and I'm going to make a commitment to fight for this. But unfortunately, you don't see this every day. It does take a unique act of courage to stand up to the Washington status quo and the career politicians who are there. Because members of Congress have calculated that it's not worth it to support term limits if it means they might have to lose a cushy job. So thank you, Josh, from everyone at U.S. Term Limits for making this commitment. We're confident that if you go to Washington, you will fight for a constitutional amendment to term limit Congress. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me add on to one thing that Nick said, because I think it's an important point. When the framers of the Constitution and founding fathers of our country were envisioning what America would look like, they envisioned a nation where butchers and tailors and lawyers and doctors and farmers would go to Washington, do good by their constituents, and then come home and live under the budget and laws they created. They did not envision an America where people like Sherrod Brown and others would go to Washington to spend their entire adult life. They especially did not envision an America where candidates for office, like Sherrod Brown, would campaign on term limits, look the voters in the eye and make them a pledge, and then lie about it. Because once he got in there, he quote-unquote changed his mind. Listen, Washington changes people. It's not only Sherrod Brown. There's folks on the Republican side of the aisle as well. Like I said earlier, they go to Washington to do good, and they stay in Washington to do well. They get addicted to it. And what we're running against here is that addiction. We're running against Republicans and Democrats who went to Washington and forgot who they were, forgot where they came from, and forgot the people they represent. When I go to Washington, I'll remember who my boss is. My boss is the 11.5 million people of the state of Ohio. And I'm not going to Washington to spend my entire adult life there. I'm going to go there, do as much good as I can for the people of Ohio, and then I'm going to come home and live under the budget and laws that I created. Let me move over here and sign this pledge. Now, before we take questions, Before we take questions, I wanted to hold something up. Jim Province? So this is from Toledo Blade. The date on this is 2004. Friday, April 9th, 2004. This is an article, I'm going to quote this, in which Sherrod Brown told voters in 1992 that he supported a 12-year limit on congressional service. So I encourage all the reporters in this room to ask Sherrod Brown if he supported a 12-year limit on congressional service. Why has he been in Washington for 25 years? Thank you very much.